The town voted to run the Mexican healer out. She voted to stand in his doorway. The meeting was held in the church on a Thursday evening in October, and the meeting was about Mateo Reyes. Mateo Reyes was a healer. He had come to the small town of Sagebrush Flat, New Mexico Territory, in the early spring, riding in on a dusty brown mule with a heavy leather satchel full of dried herbs and hand-prepared tinctures and carefully wrapped poultices, and the quiet, unhurried manner of a man who has been practicing his craft for a very long time, since boyhood, and who does not need to announce his credentials because the work announces them. He had rented a small clean room above the saddle maker's shop on the south end of Main Street, and he had begun treating people. The ailments that the town's only licensed doctor, a man named Hadley, who drank considerably more whiskey than he ever prescribed to his patients, could not or would not treat. Fevers that would not break, burns that had gone septic, the croup that came sweeping through the children every autumn like clockwork, the deep joint pain that settled into the ranchers and miners and old vaqueros like weather into stone, aching with every change of season. He treated people who came to him. He did not advertise his services. He did not post a sign or a shingle. He did not undercut Dr. Hadley's prices, because he did not charge set prices at all. He accepted what people could pay, and what people could pay ranged from nothing to a few coins, to a chicken, to a sack of flour. And Mateo Reyes accepted all of it without complaint, with the same quiet nod and the same steady brown hands and the same dark, patient eyes that looked at a person's ailment the way a carpenter looks at a broken chair, as a practical problem to be understood and carefully fixed, not as a mystery or a divine punishment. The trouble was not that he was a healer. The trouble was that he was Mexican. And the trouble with being Mexican in Sagebrush Flat in 1887 was that the town had been founded by Anglo settlers who had come from Texas and Missouri, and who had brought with them, along with their cattle and their plows and their families, a set of deeply held convictions about who belonged on the land and who did not. And those convictions were older than the town itself, and deeper than any of the wells, and harder to dig out than the copper ore buried deep in the hills above the valley. Dr. Hadley started the petition. He started it because Mateo Reyes was steadily taking his patients, not aggressively, not deliberately, but by the simple mechanism of competence. People went to Mateo because Mateo helped them, and they stopped going to Hadley because Hadley did not, and the stopping was a simple economic fact that Hadley chose to interpret as a cultural and racial one, because culture was a weapon that could mobilize a town meeting, and economics was just a private complaint. The petition said that an unlicensed Mexican practitioner of folk medicine had no legal right to treat patients in the territory and represented a danger to public health. The petition did not mention that Dr. Hadley had not renewed his own license in 4 years, or that the whiskey had made his hands unreliable, or that 3 people in Sagebrush Flat had been made worse by his treatments in the last 6 months. The petition mentioned none of this because petitions are never about truth. They are about signatures, and signatures are about power. The meeting in the church was to vote on the petition. Hadley stood at the front and read it aloud, and the reading was slow and solemn, and official in the way that readings are, when the person reading believes that formality is a substitute for legitimacy. 31 men attended, filling the pews on both sides of the center aisle. 2 women attended, sitting together in the back pew, because the meeting was understood by everyone present to be a men's matter, the way property and law and the removal of people were understood to be men's matters in towns like Sagebrush Flat in 1887. One of the 2 women was Cecily Ward. Cecily Ward was 30 years old, and she owned the laundry on the west end of Main Street, which she had inherited from her aunt 3 years earlier, when her aunt died of the same persistent fever that Mateo Reyes now treated effectively with a bark tea brewed from willow and cinchona that worked better than anything Dr. Hadley had ever prescribed or would ever prescribe. Cecily was unmarried. She was plain-spoken and sharp-eyed, and she ran the laundry with a competence that the men of Sagebrush Flat respected in the particular way that men respect a competent woman, which is to say, they acknowledged it in public while quietly wishing, in private, that it were housed in a man who would be easier to categorize. Cecily had gone to Mateo Reyes in late August, when a burn on her forearm from the laundry's boiling vat had become infected, and the infection had spread, and the arm had swollen to twice its size, and the pain had become a constant presence that she could not ignore and could not afford to address. Because addressing it meant going to Dr. Hadley, whose standard treatment for infection was cauterization with a hot iron and whiskey for the pain, and Cecily did not trust Dr. Hadley's whiskey-shaking hands with a hot iron any more than she trusted those same hands with a scalpel or a needle. Mateo had treated the angry burn with a poultice of maguey and raw honey and calendula petals. He had cleaned the infection with a wash of boiled herbs that smelled sharp and green and medicinal. He had wrapped the arm in clean cotton and changed the dressing every day for a week. And at the end of the week, the infection was gone, and the arm was healing, and the scar, when it finally formed, was small and clean and did not limit the use of the arm in any way. He had charged her nothing, and when she pressed $1 on him, he had given it back. She sat in the back pew of the church, and she listened to Dr. Hadley read the petition, and she listened to the men discuss it. The discussion was not a discussion, it was a confirmation. The real question was never whether to run Mateo Reyes out of Sagebrush Flat, but how, whether to give him 3 days or a week, whether to send a committee or the sheriff, whether the removal should be formal or informal, polite or forcible. The how was the only variable. The what had been settled before anyone sat down in a pew. The vote was 24-7 in favor of removal. The 7 who voted against it were men who had been treated by Mateo, or whose children had been treated by Mateo, and their votes were cast quietly, almost apologetically, and without speeches, because speaking against the majority in a small frontier town is a cost that most people calculate very carefully before they pay, and the calculation usually comes out on the side of silence. Cecily did not vote because women did not vote. But Cecily spoke. She stood up from the back pew after the vote was counted, and the number announced, and she said, in a voice that carried to the front of the church, with the particular clarity of a woman who has been silent through an entire proceeding, and whose silence has been storing pressure, the way a boiler stores steam, until the valve gives way. You have voted to remove the only person in this town who can treat a burn without making it worse. You have voted to remove the man who cured Everett Doyle's daughter of the croup when Dr. Hadley said she would die. You have voted to remove the man who set Hank Pollard's broken wrist so cleanly that Hank can still rope with that hand. You have voted on this because he is Mexican, not because he is incompetent, and every one of you knows it, and the knowing will sit in you for a long time, whether you ever admit it or not. The church was quiet after she spoke. The quiet was not agreement or shame, it was discomfort. The discomfort of men who have been told the plain truth in a church, a place where truth is supposed to be told and honored, and who are not accustomed to hearing it from a woman in the back pew. The committee went to Mateo's room the next morning. 3 men, Hadley, the deputy sheriff named Greer, and a rancher named Tull, who owned land north of town, and who had been the loudest voice at the meeting. They climbed the stairs to the room above the saddlemaker's shop. They knocked on the door. Cecily was standing in the doorway. She had arrived at 6 o'clock that morning, a full hour before the committee was expected. She had brought a straight-backed wooden chair from the laundry. She had placed the chair squarely in the doorway of Mateo's room, and she had sat down in it, and she was sitting there when the 3 men came up the stairs, sitting with her hands folded calmly in her lap, and her back straight as a fence post, and her expression composed and unreadable, and her burned arm, healed and cleanly scarred by Mateo's careful treatment, visible below the deliberately rolled sleeve of her blouse. "Move aside, Cecily," Greer said. "No. This is official business. This is 3 men climbing a staircase to do something they know in their hearts is wrong. That is not official business. That is cowardice, dressed up as a committee." Tull stepped forward. The town voted. The town voted to remove a healer because of where he was born. The town did not vote to remove the woman sitting in his doorway. "If you want to reach Mateo Reyes, you will have to move me. And if you lay a hand on me, every woman in Sagebrush Flat will know about it before the noon bell rings. And every single woman in Sagebrush Flat does your laundry and your cooking and your mending and your marketing. And I would strongly encourage you to think carefully about what it means to lay hands on a woman sitting in a doorway in broad daylight in front of God and this entire street. Greer looked at Tull. Tull looked at Hadley. Hadley looked at Cecily's arm, the arm he had refused to treat without cauterization, the arm that Mateo had healed cleanly and completely with herbs and patience. And the looking was the thing that he could not sustain, because the arm was living evidence, and living evidence is infinitely harder to argue with than a petition full of signatures. They left. They left because Cecily Ward was sitting in that narrow doorway, and because the sitting was not a protest or a theatrical performance, but a simple and immovable fact, the fact of a woman's body planted between a healer and the men who had come to remove him, and the fact was immovable. Not because Cecily was physically strong, but because moving her would have required the kind of ugly public force that even men who had voted 24-7 in the privacy of a church pew were not willing to use in broad daylight on a public street, with witnesses watching from every window. Mateo came to the doorway after they left. He had been inside the room during the entire encounter. He had not come out. He had not come out because Cecily had told him firmly not to, because she had understood with sharp tactical clarity that his presence in the doorway would change the nature of the confrontation from a woman defending a principle to a man and a woman defying a committee, and the first was considerably harder to answer with force than the second. "You did not have to do that," Mateo said. "You healed my arm when no one else would touch it. You healed Everett Doyle's daughter when the doctor said she was done for. You have healed half this town, one patient at a time, and asked for nothing in return. Someone had to stand in the door. It did not have to be you. Yes, it did. Because I am the one who is not afraid of them, and you should not have to be afraid of them either. Not in your own doorway. And the only way to prove that is to stand where they can see you standing, and refuse to move." Mateo looked at Cecily. He looked at her with the steady, dark, patient eyes that had looked at her burned arm and seen a problem to be fixed. And now those eyes were seeing something else. A woman who had placed herself between him and the town, not because she was reckless or dramatic or looking for a fight, but because she understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman whose arm bore the proof, that some things are worth the cost of standing still. "Would you like to come in?" he said quietly. "I have coffee on the stove, and I would like to look at your arm again. The scar tissue may benefit from an application of oil. The scar is fine. The scar is good. I would still like to look at it." She went in. She went in and she sat in the chair by the window, and Mateo examined her arm with the same careful hands that had treated it in August, and the examination was gentle and thorough and unnecessary, because the arm was healed, but the examining was not really about the arm. It was about the touching. It was about a man's careful hands on a woman's scarred skin with the particular tenderness that comes from having healed that skin once before, and from caring deeply whether it remains whole and healthy. And the caring was the thing that had started in August, and had grown slowly and steadily through September and October, in the quiet way that things grow between two people who share a language of care and courage that the people around them do not speak and cannot hear. The committee did not come back. Not that day, not the next week, not ever. The petition was not enforced. Mateo Reyes stayed in Sagebrush Flat because one woman named Cecily Ward sat in a wooden chair in a doorway, and because the sitting changed the calculation, not for everyone, not permanently, but enough that the removal became more trouble than it was worth. And that slim margin of more trouble than it was worth was the space that allowed a good man to stay, and a brave woman to choose him, and a scar to continue healing, and a narrow doorway above a saddle-maker's shop to become, in the quiet grammar of a frontier town, a threshold crossed willingly in both directions. Mateo continued to treat people. Cecily continued to do laundry. The distance between the laundry on the west end of Main Street and the room above the saddle-maker's shop on the south end was 3 dusty blocks, and the 3 blocks became shorter every day, because Cecily walked them every evening after closing the laundry to check on Mateo, and because Mateo walked them every morning to bring Cecily a cup of the bark tea that he made for himself and that Cecily had developed a taste for. and the daily walking was the courtship, and the courtship was the walking, and the town watched from its porches and its windows, and the town adjusted, slowly and grudgingly, the way frontier towns do when something that was not there before becomes something that plainly and undeniably is.